Hello, you're listening to the Theologues Roundtable Podcast. I am your host, Zach Perkins, writer, editor, and co-founder of Theologues.com, which is an online forum of individuals bringing to you articles and in-depth conversations on theology and tradition. In this show, we're all about Christ and His church. So let me start by introducing our panelists tonight. We got some really good guests and a really hot topic tonight. We're going to actually be doing an interview for the first half of the show, and the second half we're going to get into a big question on the ethics of life within the Christian theological spectrum. So let me first introduce my co-founder, my Hardy to my Laurel, Mr. Brandon Peach.
Yes, that's one way of saying it. Thank you for introducing me as the Hardy to your Laurel. I would describe you as the Robin to my Batman when Robin was a girl in Frank Miller's The Dark Knight Returns. But I do want to say good evening to everybody, and good evening. Thank you so much for joining us this night on our round table discussion. I'm really excited about this episode for a number of reasons, and not just because I say that on every episode. As a matter of fact, having Aaron Cobb as our guest and delving into some very deep, weighty, and sometimes uncomfortable subjects is something that I get a lot out of, because I find myself learning even more than I talk, which, as you all know, tends to be quite a lot. But we also have our returning friend Ron Belgau of spiritualfriendship.com, someone that we've had on as our guest. He's joining us this evening as a panelist, and I'm very interested to hear his input as well as we interview Aaron. So without any further ado, Zach, why don't you take the time to let the rest of our guests get to know our audience and vice versa. And before we do that, by the way, I am monitoring this on live stream. So if you're talking with us tonight on live stream, Loving Samuel, the link was sent out on our website, theologues.com. It was sent out on our Facebook page and on Twitter, so you can find us there. You can leave your questions live, and we will do the very best that we can to answer those for you. And if we can't, well, then the question was bad, or we ran out of time due to my rambling.
Okay, so let me first introduce Billy, though. He's going to be our another special guest we have on here tonight. Billy is the, as I've said before, our token Catholic and blogger extraordinaire. So welcome, Billy.
Thank you. I guess I've been on this enough times that I'm no longer a special guest.
Well, at least not to Brandon, but to me you are.
Thank you.
Okay, so let me introduce...
You're still special.
Let me introduce Ron first. Ron is a returning guest to the Roundtable. We had him on for the Sexuality in the Church episode, invoking his expertise as the co-founder of the blog Spiritual Friendship. And Ron is now back to talk about his other area of expertise, ethics. Ron teaches medical ethics and ethics and philosophy at St. Louis University. Welcome back, Ron.
Thank you very much. I'm also a token Catholic here, so we're beginning to get the numbers to really make a takeover. Just letting you know.
I'm so happy to have you here.
It helps Billy feel.
These people do to me.
Helps Billy feel special.
Yes, I do. I've been on the show before.
He knows all too well.
And once again, the Roman Catholic Church will be the only one.
Okay. Before the Papists take over, let me introduce our next guest, Aaron Cobb. Aaron D. Cobb is an assistant professor of philosophy at Auburn University at Montgomery. His primary area is teaching medical ethics, and his research focuses primarily on the history of the philosophy of science. Aaron is with us to discuss his new book, Loving Samuel, which was published on June 9th of this year. Its full title is Loving Samuel, Suffering, Dependence, and the Calling of Love, published through Wipf and Stock Publishers. And you can find it today on Amazon or many other bookstores. But the book is about a retelling of Aaron and his wife's experience in welcoming their son Samuel to the world. Samuel was diagnosed with a chromosomal abnormality known as trisomy 18. Samuel died on January 2nd, 2012, just 5 hours after birth, but his life still had a profound impact on those around him. Loving Samuel contains many reflections on grieving, loss, the human condition, friendship, and the joy of human life. I read the book, and I think I was near tears many, many times. So, Aaron, with that introduction, welcome to our show.
Thanks, Zach. It's nice to be here.
Aaron, let's kind of dive right into the questions about the book. I really have some things I want to talk to you about.
Sure.
And first, I guess I'm going to let you describe Loving Samuel, the book, and tell us why you decided to write the book.
Oh, good. Actually, the decision to write the book was sort of, it wasn't like an intentional thing that I set out to do from the start. I started writing about our experience when we learned of Sam's diagnosis, and I just needed a way to process the feelings of grief and the experiences that we were going through. I needed a way to try to sort out what it meant to love Samuel, what it meant to be his father, what it meant to be a husband to my wife in the midst of this experience, what it meant to be a father to my, at that point, 4-year-old son, Micah. And so writing was just a way for me to process the grief and the suffering and the experience of what it meant to love him. So that was that's where it started. After his death, I continued this, and I shared periodically with friends on my Facebook page and other things like that, some things that I was thinking, and people would give me, kind and encouraging words often. But about in the 6 months or so after Sam passed away, doing research and scholarship that I was supposed to be doing for my work was really, really difficult. C.S. Lewis talks about how paralyzing grief can be, and I felt that often when I tried to do my scholarship. But when I would sit in front of the computer and when I would write about grief, when I would write about our family, when I would write about the experience of welcoming Samuel, there was real joy and real meaning in that. And so I just kept writing random thoughts throughout those 6 months, and visited family in the summer of it was around June of 2012, and met up with a mentor and friend who I had done work with at St. Louis University, Father Kavanaugh. And we met just to talk about our work and just to sort of catch up. And that conversation quickly became a conversation about life and about suffering and about what it meant to trust in the midst of grief. And Father Kavanaugh he said to me, well, why don't you write for non-academics? Why don't you write for a general audience about your experience? And he had no idea that I'd already been writing these sort of random thoughts. And his conversation with me that day sort of triggered something in me. Like, this is part of my vocation. This is part of what it means to be a scholar, what it means to be a father. And I needed to do this. So I decided to try to collect everything together and sort of put some form into what was at that point sort of just random assorted thoughts. And so that's how it came to be. That's how the process started.
Wow. And that sounds like a really long process, kind of a lot of things that you had to kind of sort out in your head and process through that time.
Yes.
Brandon, I believe, had our next question, so I'll let Brandon take the floor.
Well, Aaron, I haven't read your book, but I've read a lot about you online, and I haven't had the chance to read anything other than your blog.
Sure.
But I do know about trisomy 18, about Edwards syndrome, how it affects 1 in 6,000 births, about the diagnosis, which is typically death, how it affects boys more than it affects girls. And as the father of a 3-month-old who has certain special needs himself, and as the brother-in-law of a 14-year-old very precarious boy with Down syndrome and autism, birth defects, especially ones that are crippling for the person and that can be tragic to the parents. I think my question to you is, first, when did you learn that Samuel had this genetic predisposition, and how did you and your wife deal with that?
So we learned around 13 weeks into the pregnancy there were some ultrasound markers for an abdominal wall defect known as an omphalocele, and this is very atypical, but it tends to run and it tends to be associated with other chromosomal abnormalities. So we found out around 13 weeks that Sam had this abdominal wall defect. And of course, then once there's a signal or a marker for something like that, they start wanting to do more testing, and they wanted to see what was happening. So we learned about 20 weeks into the pregnancy about trisomy 18, and it sort of explained the host of abnormalities that they were seeing at that point. In addition to the abdominal wall defect, there were clubbed feet, there were clenched fists, there was a sort of a strawberry-shaped head. And so they see all these things together, and they it's clear that these are markers for trisomy 18. And that was confirmed around 21 weeks into the pregnancy. So that's when we learned. So at that point we had about 6 or 7, maybe 8 weeks at that point to sort of grow accustomed to the idea that there were going to be difficulties in his future and in our future. And so we were sort of trying to put a plan in place for how to deal with what we expected would be, a surgery or something like that after his birth. Once we learned about trisomy 18 and the host of other abnormalities, we realized the specialists at that point said that there was nothing that they would recommend, that we should just go and try to make it to birth, because trisomy 18 has something like 50 to 60% of children who are diagnosed in utero with trisomy 18. It ends with a in utero demise anyways. And so it was improbable that he would make it to birth. And if he made it to birth, something like 90 to 95% of these children will die before their first birthday. And so this was sort of the diagnosis that was laid on us in the specialist office that day when we got the diagnosis. And so we just sort of had to come back and recover from the shock initially, and then try to put together what we thought would be a plan to care for him throughout the rest of the pregnancy. And so it was a shock, but at the same time, it gave us ample opportunity to think about what we needed to do to care for him and to express our love for him in the midst of the experience. So we spent the next 3 months or so trying to make life as normal for our 4-year-old son, as much normal as possible. And my wife Alicia and I would spend evenings talking about suffering, talking about grief, talking about the things that people had said to us that were genuinely comforting, the friends who were walking with us, talking about some of the things that folks had said to us that were not so comforting and were maybe a little frustrating for us. And so it was 3 months of an extended conversation about what it meant to love him, and it was in many ways a time of real bonding and love with each other in the midst of that real difficult time.
And for our listeners who don't know so much about trisomy 18, I mean, there's a less than 10% chance that children born with this particular defect will live to their first birthday. Mm-hmm. A very, very small percentage of people who are diagnosed with trisomy 18 live into even their second decade, mm-hmm. and far fewer into their third decade. Mm-hmm. And there are almost always complications and developmental disabilities associated with that. So given that information to the people that are listening right now, I guess This is such a difficult question, and I know that you've talked about this a lot. You've written about it, and certainly you've fielded a ton of questions about it. And I hope I don't open any wounds by asking you, when did the grieving process start, or when did this sense of hope that you had for Samuel, was there any point that you lost hope that you would have Samuel as a child beyond his childhood?
Well, when we were given that information, it was, the diagnosis is pretty clear, and the specialist, especially with the host of other associated anomalies that they saw, they told us that this was not the sort of thing that one could live very long with. So we knew instantly that our hope for a child who would sort of grow out of these difficulties was not that was not even on the table. And it's interesting. Hope works in, I think, really weird ways sometimes. So there are the hope for a healthy and typical child was initially just off the table when we learned of the first set of anomalies and abnormalities. But then we hope for at least the ability to welcome him and to care for him, and through his difficulties to care for a child, and we would have welcomed the opportunity to care for a child with disabilities. But then that hope sort of went off the table as well. So, it was a matter of restructuring our hopes at that point. And at this point, the hope became the hope to see him alive, born alive. That became our hope. But we spent the better part of 3 months just not sure whether that would be possible. We were told to expect in utero demise at any point. So we went to the Alicia's obstetrician weekly, every Friday for about 3 months. And she was very kind and very caring to us, and allowed us, we would come in, we would listen for a heartbeat, we would have an ultrasound to see him. And I remember her asking Alicia when our first visit after we received the diagnosis, she said, "What can I do to make this time? What do you want me to do for you?" And Alicia said, "This is our time with Sam, and we really want to honor it, and we really want this time to be our time with him." So we aren't promised anything else.
So it was clear at that point that there was half a chance or less than that he would be born alive.
Yeah. So we were told to expect at any point that he would die in utero. So that's imagine for 3 months basically trying to be prepared for that at all times.
Yeah.
And as Alicia got increasingly more visibly pregnant, the rest of the world has no clue what's going on, apart from your close friends and that sort of stuff. So in our culture, we're very demonstrative about how we treat women who are pregnant. And so out in public in the supermarket, people asking, "How far along are you? What are you expecting? Congratulations," all these sorts of things. And Alicia's, we have this story that's sort of hidden from view that makes it even more difficult for her in that process as well. So our hopes went ratcheted down from, a healthy child, typical child, to a child with some disabilities, but a child we love and we would care for, to we just hope that he makes it to birth alive so that we can hold him and see him sort of and be able to experience his birth and experience him that way.
Wow.
So we spent 3 months dealing with that. So.
Yeah, I can imagine how hard that would be. I mean, my wife would get at least a dozen questions a week about when we were having our children, and I can imagine how I understand. I kind of got through your book how hard that is, but I think your wife probably had a much different experience. I'm not going to say harder, but probably a little bit more harsher in certain degrees.
Sure. Yes. Absolutely.
Yeah. I know that Ron has a question, so now I'm going to give Ron the table.
Thanks. So actually this kind of follows on that observation that you were making about the way that people would, come up to you and congratulate you. I think you also talked about in the book how, seeing another family playing with their happy, healthy baby, these were things that kind of alienated you from people, made it harder to be close to others.
Mm-hmm.
But then also, and one of the things that really struck me about the book was the insights that you had about friendship and the way that this experience really deepened your relationship with some of the people, and those friendships were
mm-hmm.
absolutely crucial to getting through this experience.
Yes. Yeah.
And so I wonder if you could just reflect on that a bit more. I thought that was a great part of the book.
Thanks, Ron. It's weird. Grief is weird, and one of the things that I've come to realize in the process of grieving and sort of anticipating his death, so anticipatory grief, and then grieving his actual passing. One of the things I've realized is just how difficult it is to be friends with people who are grieving. So on the one hand, it's very difficult for us to see a family with healthy children who don't think twice about the thought of losing a child doesn't even cross their mind, and the thought of, and in some ways it's they don't want to see our family because our family is the epitome or the personification of their worst fears. So in that sense, it's alienating. But in another sense, there's we have friends who made our decisions and our experience with Sam more beautiful and more hopeful and more grace-filled than we could have possibly imagined. So here's, I think, the biggest example. The night that Sam was delivered in the hospital, I had no idea, but we had several friends who came to the hospital to pray for us, and I invited them back to the room to meet Sam. And one of our friends, saw him and said how beautiful he was, and then congratulated us. And this is weird. It's not something I expected, and it's not something that I realized how much I needed to hear. But here was a birth of a child who was loved, and the birth experience was as normal as you could possibly imagine. And what you say to people when they give birth is congratulations, because there's a beautiful life here. And even though he was already sort of slipping away, those words were a ministry to us. So on the one hand, it's very hard to be friends with people who are grieving, but it's very important to be friends with people who are grieving, because it's those friendships that offer the hope and the courage and the grace to continue on with what is a difficult calling.
Yeah. And I can imagine too, like as friendships go, there are lessons to be learned as on the other side when you're a friend of, how to sit with that person and through the grieving process. And I think that I have a hard time. I know that I personally do, because I haven't faced a whole lot of that grieving process yet in my life. I know I will sometime, but that when people are going through the grieving process, knowing what to say, when to say it, or even if you just need to stay quiet, as was the case with Job. He had many friends saying many things to him, but in some ways he just needed somebody to be quiet for a little bit and sit with him and listen. I'm sure that was valuable to you on many different levels.
I mean, I think Christians, so let me say it this way. So often when we're confronted by people who are suffering, when we speak words to them and when we're trying to comfort them, I think often the words we speak are a reflection more of our own anxieties about the suffering than they are about what the person really needs to hear at that moment. And so Alicia and I never really worried or asked the why question, which is, often associated with suffering. We understood why this happened. This is a genetic anomaly. This occurs naturally. we didn't see behind the genetic anomaly some sort of divine intention or something of that nature. What we were concerned about and what we really needed in this experience was friends who would stick with us and who would help us to see how God was present to us in the midst of this suffering and how God was bringing redemption in the midst of this story. And so often the words that Christians speak to other Christians have to deal with, in the midst of suffering, have to deal with trying to justify or explain the suffering in the person's life. And I think my experience suggests that most often what people need in this context is for people to lament with them, to sit quietly with them, and to listen to them. And so I've... Again, this is one of those things in which it's hard to be friends with those who grieve because it's often difficult to know what they need. Yeah. But you can't know what they need unless you listen. So I think that my counsel typically in this context is to go in and listen and to offer your friendship silently first.
Yeah.
Yeah. You know, I had a pastor who lost 2 wives to cancer. This was years and years ago, and he said that he had a lot of friends come by, and they tried to talk with him, and they said everything from, "We're here for you, we're praying for you, what can I do for you?" trying to make meals, trying to engage him in conversation, and he was just so numb. And he said he had a close friend from many years who came to his house and just sat and didn't say anything at all. He just sat there, and when he was spoken to, he would speak. And my pastor at the time said, I'll never forget it. And he said with tears in his eyes, "I always hated to see him leave."
Mm-hmm. Wow. Well, there's so much levity right now. This is probably the most serious we've been on the podcast in a long time. I'll just say that. I'm going to go to Billy, because I know that we haven't called on Billy in a little while. But Billy, do you have anything to weigh in here?
I guess there's so much that's on my heart, and I really appreciate you sharing a bit of your life story. I think that even when we may not have suffering in our lives, we're often surrounded by people who are going through suffering, and hearing that wisdom is really valuable. The question, I guess, that comes to my mind is, in the midst of all these encounters and struggles and moments of grace that you're finding in your relationship, how did you navigate extending that grace and dealing with that with your son, who I'm sure didn't fully understand what was going on? And I guess as a parent who's tried to navigate through grief with my own children, I was wondering what your experience was like.
Yeah, Micah is a wonderful boy, and in many ways, he's taught me more about grief and about faith in this experience than maybe I've taught him. I think this is I look to my wife a lot in this context because I think she has a knack for knowing how to talk to him in his grief. He had moments of just, as you probably can imagine, of just deep sorrow, and I can remember several times, sitting with him and crying with him and holding him and I think that's been really, it's shaped him. He will grow up being a child who has experienced grief at a very young age. So I think that's going to be part of his story. But it's interesting to me in listening to him. So when he talks about Samuel, his brother, and when he talks about the experience, he always talks in the present tense. So Sam is still alive in his mind, so he's still present. And in many ways, when I talk about Samuel, I talk about him in sort of the past tense. And I think that there is lessons there for me as a father in terms of what faith in God means, and what it means to believe in the resurrection, what it means to believe in what is our true hope. And And so I think what my wife and I tried to do was just to talk to Micah about the sort of reality of it. So he needed to know that his brother wasn't really going to be able to come home, and he needed to prepare for that. But he needed to know that even though we weren't going to be able to bring Samuel home, that we could still express our love for him and to him, and that we loved him no matter what. So I can remember we took him with us to one of the ultrasound, to see one of the ultrasounds so he could see his brother sort of etched on the screen. We talked about Sam. Sam was very much a part of our experience here. And even now, when he goes to school, one of the things we put on our forms when we're sending him away for second grade now is Micah had a younger brother who passed away, and Micah will talk about him because Sam is very important, and it's really important to us that you all don't silence that. It's very important for us that people honor Micah's discussions and thinkings out loud about his brother. So on the one hand, there was deep sorrow, and he experienced deep sorrow, and we just tried to sit with him and cry with him and talk to him about that, and talk to him about what it meant to trust in God in the midst of sorrow. But on the other hand, he also has revealed to me just sometimes how I ought to be thinking about Sam, and how I ought to be understanding what my faith really entails for Sam's current condition. So I've learned a great deal from him in the process from listening to him, and I'm hopeful that he remembers his parents as trusting God no matter what in the midst of this experience.
Okay, so we're going to come up on the break here, but pretty soon. But I just want to say that, Aaron, after reading your book and kind of getting a better picture of the experience you had, the Loving Samuel is probably one of the deepest resources I've come across, next to C.S. Lewis's works on suffering and pain, and I could tell that you drew a lot from that. Can you tell me a little bit of some of the resources that were comforting you through that processing of your grief?
Absolutely. Excuse me, I just have a little frog in my throat right now.
It's okay.
So I think the most important book that I read in the midst of our experience was a book by Nicholas Wolterstorff called Lament for a Son. He lost a son in a hiking accident, and his son was older than Samuel, of course, but it is just it's a profound reflection on loss and on grief. And that book, more than any other book I read, was life-giving to me. Let me put it this way. During my college years, my father passed away between my freshman and sophomore year of college, and I tried to read Lament for a Son at that point, and it didn't. I couldn't do it. But this time around, maybe it's because of the shared connection with the loss of a child. This book meant more than I can possibly express. I also read during this time, Henry Nouwen has a book on, I've lost the title on it right now, but it's on grief, and it's on death and suffering and death, and it's also a very profound reflection. And of course, the C.S. Lewis work, A Grief Observed, as I read often. I don't read The Problem of Pain as much as I read A Grief Observed, because I think I relate more to what Lewis is doing in A Grief Observed than I did to the more intellectual, abstract, philosophical thinking about the problem of evil and pain and that sort of stuff. When you're in the midst of a very deep and a difficult experience, what you want is people to lament with, and Lewis and Wolterstorff and Nouwen were good friends in that context.
Yeah. Well,
that's why the book. That's why A Grief Observed is so important in many ways, because The Problem of Pain was written before Lewis was married, and before the before the sickness and death of joy. And his opinion on his book, A Problem of Pain, changed dramatically when he went through that situation. It's a very raw and experiential book, and it doesn't offer very many answers. It just offers experience.
So we have kind of covered now a very personal experience related to pain and grief. And in the second half of the show, we're going to talk a little bit more of the wider scope of the ethics of life and also suffering in relation to how we view life today. And so we're going to take a break now. But first, I want to again plug Aaron's book, Loving Samuel, Suffering, Dependence, and the Calling of Love. Again, that full title, because as Aaron pointed out earlier, if you Google Loving Samuel, you'll get a romance book as the top result instead of the full title, Loving Samuel, Suffering, Dependence, and the Calling of Love.
I accidentally read that one, and it did not pertain to this discussion at all.
You're like, what is this?
Very frustrating. Poorly written.
Aaron, can you also tell us? I know it's on Amazon, but is it available in pretty much any Christian bookstore out there?
You should be able to find it at any Christian bookstore, and you can buy it directly from the publisher as well. So,
okay, that's Whiffenstock Publishers, and I think that's how you www.whiffenstock or something like that is the website. Okay.
And the imprint is Cascade Books, so if you can't remember Whiffenstock, Cascade Books would be there as well. So
that's probably easier, yeah.
Yes.
Okay, well, we're going to take a break, and when we come back, we'll be talking about the Christian ethics on life. Thank you, and we'll be back. Hey guys, thanks for listening to this episode. We'll get back to the conversation, but I just have a couple things I want to direct you guys to before we get into the second half. First, we have some exciting guests coming on in the next few weeks. Seriously, it's ridiculous. We'll have people like Matthew Paul Turner on September 27th talking about his new book, Our Great Big American God. And then on October 11th, we'll have Derek Flood on to talk about a book he'll be having coming out as well as some of his past writings. So you'll definitely want to check those episodes out. And that's just the people we have clinched. I mean, we have some other people that we have been talking to and possibly will be lining up in the future, some recognizable names. And we'll announce those dates in the coming weeks. So the second thing I wanted to talk about is if you like the podcast, we'd appreciate a review either on iTunes or on Stitcher. If you're not aware, we're on Stitcher now. You can look us up as Theologs on the search on Stitcher. Just go on to the sites and put in a little rating or a blurb about how awesome we are. We'll be sure to read your blurb on the show and make you famous for about 10 seconds. Please also like our Facebook page at facebook.com/theologs or follow us on Twitter at twitter.com/theologs. And if you peruse the site a little bit at theologs.com, you'll find some freaking amazing articles that might hurt your brain. Or maybe not. But if you like what you read, please share the articles and comment. We appreciate all of the participation. And I hope you guys enjoy the rest of the show. It's a good one. Welcome back to the Theologs podcast. We are here with Billy and Brandon and Ron and Aaron, and we had just had a great discussion with Aaron about his book, Loving Samuel. And now we're going to dive into a discussion about the Christian ethics on life. Particularly, we're going to talk about when children are born with genetic abnormalities, and kind of how we speak into culture about our values on life, and how that all kind of works into the bigger picture. I'm actually going to let Ron Belgau kind of guide us and steer us in this discussion. So I'm going to hand it off to Ron and let Ron kind of go into what we're going to talk about.
Well, thank you. So one of the things that struck me as I was reading the book is the question of what makes a human life valuable. And I think this is a question that when I teach medical ethics, when we discuss, it's really apparent that in our culture, there's a lot of disagreement, and people have a hard time figuring out a way of thinking about the value of human life that we can all agree on. And the big divide is between the question of, do human lives just have a kind of inherent intrinsic dignity, or is that dignity something that's dependent on a certain level of development or something like that? One of the stories that really struck me in reading the book, because it dealt with Father Kavanaugh, who both Aaron and I learned medical ethics from. So Father Kavanaugh told a story which Aaron relates in the book about this severely disabled child who was born and lived only a very short life and died. And in a moment of despair, he was talking to a friend of his who had nursed and cared for this child. Tamika was her name. And he said, "What on earth did Tamika ever have?" And his friend responded, "She had the power to call out love from me." So I'd like to start just with that reflection of, is the value of a human life in what that person can do, their consciousness, their ability to think, etc., or is the value in their ability to call forth love? And I think this book was just a beautiful meditation on the answer that the value is that a human life can have value even if the child is never going to grow up to be a professor of philosophy.
Yeah, thanks, Ron. I think that's really well put. So yes, we both studied under Father Kavanaugh, and I was struck because when Father Kavanaugh frames the issues when he's teaching medical ethics, when he talks about the ethics of life, he often, one of the questions is, does human life in its earliest phases have the same value as human life in all its phases, independent of the ability to actually exercise higher level faculties and those sorts of things? And I was struck just in my own experience of how little that question wasn't as salient in my mind during the experience. The question that was salient to me in the experience was, this is my son. That the kind of, and I love him already. He's a gift to me, and that call on my life, the kind of responsibility I felt because of that kind of calling forth, independent of whether or not he would ever be able to perform at higher levels, was salient at the outset. And I just think that's a really important point.
Yeah. And so one of the things, like I went through a period where I was, kind of pondering these questions of, life and faith. And I almost came to the conclusion that the value that we place on life, it is almost intrinsically tied to our moral compass within us, in terms of like faith. And basically, if we take the idea of survival of the fittest to its extreme, then we come up with an abhorrent view of life. And honestly, it's almost inescapable in certain philosophical frameworks. I won't say that it's inescapable within atheism, as some people do, because I know that there are humanist atheists who value life and have a certain ethic for doing that. But in terms of the Christian framework, there's the strongest value placed on life that I've seen in many of the other places, ethical frameworks that I've studied. And it all has to go back to humans are made in the image of God. And because of that, they like going back to the point you were making and what Father Kavanaugh said, they resonate with love because God is love. And so it's a poetic way of saying it, but it's also probably the strongest thing that I can think of in terms of when a life comes into the world, it is an expression of God's love. Every person, every breath that's out that's breathed in, of life that's in this world, whether it's whether they are mentally handicapped or whatever, they have value because of that, because of God. God shows through them, and so I'll let that go with anybody else. So, anybody else want to talk?
I do actually, because we talked in the break, and we talked before we started this conversation about the fact that I've got a son, and he was born with special needs. Now, his special needs that the state of Pennsylvania in which we live, they consider him disabled, but it's very simple. He's got a couple of holes in his heart. He has a cleft palate, not a cleft lip. The soft palate in the back of his mouth is going to need to be repaired at some point. So he's considered disabled. And then I look at my brother-in-law, Sean, who has Down syndrome and autism. And the language that we use around Down syndrome and autism and people with developmental disabilities is very different than what we would have used 40, 50 years ago. It's different than what we would have used even 10 years ago. People aren't afflicted by these conditions, these genetic preconditions. They're not afflicted by them. They're not harmed by them. They're not different because of them. And so the term differently abled, even though it was something that I would have railed against years ago as being entirely too politically correct, is something that I really buy into, because I understand that someone like my brother-in-law, who is largely nonverbal, who expresses himself in very different ways, who as a 14-year-old still yesterday jumped into the pool in his backyard when we put him on the swings and were watching him, and he pooped his pants and threw his pants outside of the pool and continued to swim naked. He's not disabled. He doesn't have a disability. He's differently abled in the way that he's able to communicate to us. So the issue that I have with someone like Richard Dawkins, who we talked about in the break, and I think that we'll talk about it a little bit more here, who said that people with Down syndrome should summarily be aborted in the womb because they have nothing to contribute to society. That idea is on its face and by its nature wrong. He has a lot to contribute to us, in spite of the fact that he pooped in the pool, and yes, I did have to clean that up. But the intellectual deficiencies or the developmental disabilities that we see of many people who are diagnosed with autism or Down syndrome or even something as common as like the fashionable thing right now is to have a kid who is a high-functioning autistic, someone on the Asperger's scale. That really, really bugs me because these people have a difference in the way that they're able to communicate, not in the way that they're able to synthesize information. They get it. Information goes into the brain, and they synthesize that information as well as you or I, but they can't communicate their feelings as well. And that's one of the biggest things that I think, sort of draws me away from the idea of disability and toward the idea of differently abled. We're all created in God's image. And the moment that you tell me that my autistic and Down syndrome, quote unquote, suffering brother-in-law has less of an access to God than the rest of us do, I immediately shut down. I think, if anything, that simplicity and that need for quiet demonstrates a closer and more robust connection with the Lord than it does anything else.
I would actually, I think, turn the discussion around and say that I think one of the real benefits of thinking about the lives of those who are dependent, those who can't fulfill the American dream of being the independent, high-achieving person who makes a big impact on the world by some achievement. I think actually realizing that all of us are dependent, all of us are vulnerable. I remember a couple of years ago, I was at a conference and I received an email that let me know that one of the students in one of my classes had been killed in a car accident, which meant that the next day when I went back to teach the class, I was going to have to find something to say to the class to process that someone who was here last week and healthy and with every expectation of living another 60 years or more is gone. Not an easy class to lead, but at the same time, I think a lot of times we want to avoid realizing that we're not as independent and able to run our own lives and our own world as we think, that we're very dependent, we're very vulnerable. And one of the things that I really appreciated about the reflections in Loving Samuel was how Aaron, in reflecting on the dependency and vulnerability of his son, I think helped us to get in touch with the dependency and vulnerability that affects all of us. And I think that's a really important part of this conversation is in coming to terms with that dependency and vulnerability, I think we become softened to the need to care for others who are dependent and vulnerable in a way that if we focus on our independence, on our achievements, on our capabilities, we become very hard-hearted towards those who can't compete, as it were.
So I think Ron's point about vulnerability and dependence is an important one. In part, I think one of the reasons, especially in contexts like trisomy 18 or you hear the statistics about the amount of children who, once diagnosed in utero with Down syndrome, are aborted. When you hear about all of this, I think part of this, tying into the vulnerability and dependence, is this sort of inhospitality in our culture towards those who don't meet a certain level of functioning or meet a certain level of independence or promise or capacity. And I think this flows a little bit from this kind of despair that these lives won't meet this kind of standard, and because of that, they'll somehow suffer, or they'll somehow be worse off, or they're somehow their lives won't be as meaningful, or something like that. So I think this despair about not being able to create conditions where these lives will meet this certain level tends to create a situation in which there's a kind of inhospitality towards those children who have those conditions, and toward those families who are doing their best to love and care for those children. And so I think part of the speaking into culture about these issues requires addressing that kind of despair about lives that don't meet a certain kind of standard, which is a Western standard of health and high functioning. If we can speak to that kind of despair, because that despair creates conditions of inhospitality towards those who are particularly vulnerable or particularly dependent, I think one thing one has to do is to address that kind of despair at the outset.
Okay, so talking about that despair, like how do we go about that? Like how do we go about addressing that?
Well, so I think part of it is just people is exposure to the lives of people who have disabilities. I mean, yes, their lives are much more difficult than the typical child, but also they have gifts and graces that many people aren't aware of because they don't have, they're not friends with them, or they're not friends with the family. And so part of it is just giving those kinds of connections to families who are in the midst of the real joys and difficulties of raising children with disabilities. Part of the reason why I told our story is because I think many people, and many of my students have expressed to me about situations like ours, like it's just so futile, it's just so meaningless, and which was not my experience in our story. My experience was, yes, that our son Samuel didn't live very long, but his life was meaningful and full of many gifts and graces that I couldn't have the foggiest clue when I received the diagnosis. So part of it is just cultivating an imagination, an ability to see the gifts and graces there, which we might not see because we have in our mind just this picture of what it means to live a good life in our culture. And so I think addressing that despair involves sort of holding up exemplars and holding up stories where people can see, oh, there is meaning here, or there is joy here, oh, there is hope here where we didn't expect to see it. Something of that nature is a part of this story.
Yeah.
There's a story that I think is relevant here. I've sometimes assigned an essay called Unspeakable Conversations, which is written by a woman named Harriet McBride Johnson, who is fairly severely crippled. And it was published in the New York Times, and it's her description of a series of interactions with Peter Singer. And Peter Singer is another philosopher who thinks that parents should be allowed not only to abort seriously disabled children, but that it would be reasonable for them to euthanize seriously disabled children after birth if they learned about the disabilities then. So one of the things that she talks about in the essay is a conversation that she had with him about this family that had a comatose child, but they kept caring for the child. And to Peter Singer, that was just weird. why would the family, if the child is comatose, if the child has no chance of recovery, what value is there in the child being a burden on the caregivers? But to Harriet McBride Johnson, that family was a place of safety, because seeing that they would love their child even though she was so disabled that she couldn't talk, she couldn't move, she was just comatose. Seeing the depth of love that that family had for that child told her, you're safe in this family. This family is a family that loves without reservations. And so your handicaps, your disabilities, however you want to express it, your life is not in danger here. But when she's interacting with Peter Singer, like, here is a man who thinks that it should have been okay for her parents to kill her. A man who thinks her life is not worth living. And that's, I mean, so I think one of the things to realize in this is when we talk about how we treat, how we love someone like Samuel, it's not just the most extreme case of, a child with very little chance of living. The cultural climate that we're creating is either one in which people who don't live up to the bar can feel welcomed, can feel safe, or a cultural climate in which we're always one accident away from being a life not worth living. And, I think it's that story, I think, really has struck me in its power to illustrate how the way that we treat, Mother Teresa talked about loving the poorest of the poor. We might also talk about the most dependent of the dependent, or the most vulnerable of the vulnerable. The way that we show love in those circumstances communicates a great deal about how we will deal with imperfection, how we will deal with vulnerability in other cases. And I think that's a really important question to ask ourselves as we're thinking about these things. It's not just although it's tremendously important how we treat the most dependent of the dependent, the most vulnerable of the vulnerable, but it's also important to ask what message that sends when we say, if you can't walk, maybe your life isn't worth living. If you have various other disabilities or differences of ability, we may not think that you're worth being part of our society, and we're not going to care for you. Whereas when Aaron cares even for Samuel, that communicates something very powerful about where Aaron's family stands with every kind of disability and vulnerability.
Can I ask you one question to lead into that? How do you address the opposing argument that somebody probably like Dawkins would say that it is more merciful to end that suffering and end that life before it even has a chance to know suffering in this life, because the suffering in this life would be greater? I mean, of course, to an atheist like Dawkins, when you end in a life, there's nothing after that, so there's nothing, no healing after that in any sense. So it seems a greater, in one sense, it makes sense that in that area, it would be greater to end that suffering as quickly as possible than to allow that suffering to continue in that person's life. How do you respond to that kind of line of thinking?
Do you want to go for that, Aaron, or do you want me to go for that?
Why don't you start, Ron? That's fine.
Okay. So to some extent, I think it's less a matter of argument and in some ways more a matter of imagination, that people have to see the ways in which that kind of life can be valuable. It's not something that you can argue them into, but I mean, I found reading Loving Samuel to be, there's some very good and interesting philosophical reflection there, but the thing that I found most powerful about it was the way that it opened up my imagination to the ways that this kind of experience that looks from the outside like a tragedy, pure and simple. And from the outside, it's hard to see what could be redeeming or valuable about having a profoundly disabled child who dies. It just seems to be the dashing of every parent's hope. But listening to Aaron's experience, listening to the experience of other families that I've known with trisomy 18 and with other conditions, anencephaly and other less debilitating conditions, I think really it's by seeing families that find grace and redemption and beauty and love and closeness and friendship and all of these things in the midst of what looks like a terrible situation, that you begin to realize the argument. I mean, I think this goes back to what Aaron was saying. People who haven't seen this don't understand. They haven't seen all of the ways that life can be good. And so I think it's more a matter of reaching people's imaginations and helping them to see the potential for, and I use semi-theological language like redemption, but I don't mean it just in the sense of a lost soul making it to heaven. I mean redemption in the sense of, here is what looks like a terrible situation, but the situation itself, there's redemption of the pain and the suffering. And I think Aaron speaks to this much more profoundly than I can in the book, because he's been there and I have seen it, but not actually been in the midst of it.
So if you don't mind, I'll just tag on just a little bit too. So I think that Ron's right. It's about having our imaginations cultivated for seeing the good in the midst of suffering. And I think so often with the line about, with the counter argument about it being more merciful or it being more compassionate to end the suffering by ending the life of the sufferer, that line I think often takes the greatest evil there is in the world to be suffering itself. And I think one of the things that we need to resist is the notion that suffering is awful, no matter how you talk about it. It is awful, but that doesn't mean that we are therefore licensed to do anything we want to end that suffering, especially if that means ending the life of someone who has inherent worth or inherent dignity. And so I think part of it is, yes, we want to respond with the appropriate kind of compassion to those who are, toward those who are suffering, but we also need to think about, in addition to having our moral imaginations cultivated, we need to think about the fact that there are times in life when we are called to embrace suffering rather than to alleviate it. And often those choices involve reflection on goods that are present in the midst of suffering, and suffering which is unavoidable in life. So I think part of it is telling the stories in such a way that people can see in real life what those goods are, but also showing that sometimes to embrace those goods is to embrace the suffering that comes along with them. I think that's part of the response that needs to be in this line of thinking as well.
Gotcha.
And could I just add very briefly, so I've had more the experience of being the friend who's there when someone is dealing with a difficult situation. And I think from the perspective of a friend, as Aaron said, it can be very difficult to be friends with someone who is suffering and who is grieving. And there's the temptation to say, well, if your suffering just went away, it would be easier for me. But, I think that if I cut and ran whenever someone in my life started to go through something difficult that was going to make me feel uncomfortable, I would be a very bad human being. There's just an important part of any meaningful human life is being able to enter into and suffer with those that we love, and not to try to escape that by removing the sufferer.
Yeah.
And I think, that's something that I think we really need to be very careful about solutions that tell us, when this person is suffering, don't enter into the suffering with them. Don't, help them to see the value that can be found in suffering, but instead, we say that we're relieving their suffering, but very soon there comes to be pressure that, as euthanasia becomes more common, then it comes to be expected that you're one of those ill people who's starting to be a burden on your relatives. Why are you still here? Why have you not done the reasonable thing?
Like in Soylent Green. Sorry, I had to say that.
Yeah. So I just think what seems like an attractive, kind solution ends up denying the humanity of a larger and larger portion of the population.
Yeah, I think that's really key.
Whoa, Billy's here. Oh.
Yes.
Sorry.
So often we think of the proper response to pain, to evil, to suffering, as to try to attempt to end the suffering. And I think that although it would be great if we could help alleviate some suffering sometimes, that's not really our call. Our call is compassion. Our call is love. Our call is solidarity. These are the things that are exemplified by Jesus. And it's hard for us in this culture. Henry Nouwen once said that we're people who are addicted to putting others in their place, to identifying the function of an individual. But the gospel teaches us and reminds us that God demonstrates our value because he loves us, not because of what we can do. And I think it's just so very important that when we're dealing with suffering in our lives and in the lives of others, and evaluating the worth and dignity of those in our community and those who are sort of being invited into our community, that we recognize the belovedness is much more important than the functionality. And someone's ability to call forth love, as we talked about earlier, is just so much more in line with the nature of God than simply to alleviate the total suffering or pain in the world. So, yeah, it's a really great conversation.
Okay.
And just one thing that I think would help to, again, pump people's imaginations. I think all of us are aware that adolescence can be very difficult for many people. There's bullying, there's all of the changes that are going on, emotions, conflicts with parents. But I think, we would be horrified if our response to the realization that adolescence can be painful was for the school nurse to stock euthanasia kits. So that, if you're having a hard time, if you're really feeling bad, just go down to the school nurse and we can put you out of your suffering. We'll relieve your suffering. And I think almost everyone would recognize that that's a horrifying solution to adolescent suicide thoughts. And that if that were done, it's not just the extreme cases that go through with suicide now, that would open up more and more people feeling like that was now the accepted way of dealing with really deep despair. I think we all recognize that it's crazy to respond to that kind of suffering with, let's remove the sufferer.
Yeah.
And it seems to me that people who see quote unquote mercy killing as a solution in other situations should ask themselves, why don't we use mercy killing as a solution in those situations? Or, I'm sorry that you've lost your mother and you're going through this really tough time. If it's too much for you, I just think there's a lot of pain in human life, and what we need to do is to learn to walk with people through that pain, not despair in the face of pain and say the only possible solution is to get rid of you.
Yeah, I think that all these observations culminating together paint a certain picture of where we're at right now in our society and in humanity and how we respond to this. I think always what we're going to find is that we're going to have opposition on a philosophical level. We have picket line, people picketing against abortion, and we have all these different movements of life, and that's wonderful, and that we need to continue to move for life and on the cultural spectrum, on our societal level. But on a philosophical level, that's the harder part, breaking somebody's philosophy down a little bit to help them to understand the ethics that we believe in towards life and why we believe the way we do. Like you said, though, sparking the imagination and getting them to understand the potential of what's there in a life. That's where we're going to start to find our biggest, and in some ways our biggest triumphs. I I'm only speaking in conjecture here right now, but that's what I'm getting from this. This is going to be something that will always constantly come up, and how we deal with it in a way that Aaron has already with writing this book. And thank you again, Aaron, for doing that. I think it's going to be a huge ministry to so many people. I'm sure it already has, and helping them understand about life here. So
thank you. I appreciate that.
Yeah. So I'm going to bring it in for a landing. And what we do in this next part of the show, we have recommendations. And you can recommend anything you want. You can recommend a book or, movies, CDs, whatever. You can even recommend your favorite pair of jeans. So, and after all of that, very solemn discussion, we're supposed to transition into a more lighthearted piece of the show. So I'm going to try and do that now. I don't know how we're going to get into that, but we're going to try that. So I'll start with the recommendations, and then I'll hand it off to Brandon, because I think he's going to have to leave in a little while. But so as far as a recommendation goes, I don't have a big thing. I think I've exhausted most of my recommendations lately, because I can't read a lot lately. I have 3 kids, all under the age of 5, so reading is practically impossible. But I have been watching The Wire a lot lately, and although it's not necessarily a good Christian wholesome program, I do think that it speaks a lot to different moral issues. It's kind of incredible how you kind of dive a lot deep. You can dive into that show and kind of dig up some different moral questions about, how someone slips into just sin and right and wrong. And then the other recommendation I have is Dunkin' Donuts medium roast coffee, because that's what I've been drinking this evening, and it's wonderful. I love coffee, especially when it's Dunkin' Donuts coffee.
Oh gosh! Come on, man.
Billy, come on! I know you're going to be the coffee snob tonight, but I love Dunkin' Donuts. I know you probably have something better up your sleeve, Billy, so you can later do a coffee recommendation. But I'm going to hand it off to Brandon now.
Well, I've remained willfully silent for the past, probably longer than I've ever remained silent on any of our podcasts. Because everyone else had so much good stuff to say, and everything that I would have been able to offer was just snarky. But I do have some recommendations today.
Just being snarky has never stopped you in the past.
Right.
That's
but
true.
Zach has... See, Zach is the editor-in-chief of the site. And so when he tells me to sort of scale it back, I do that. So my recommendations for speed for people who are just not getting their work done, and for drinking early in the morning to sort of deal with the hair of the dog. Those aren't recommendations I'm going to be making this evening.
More pizza tips for us?
No, I think it was our second podcast that we decided that was not going to be an ongoing feature. I do have a couple of things to recommend, though. The first thing that I want to recommend, and I've talked about Graham Greene before, but Graham Greene is one of the greatest Catholic authors of our lifetime, and he died. Oh, I don't know. I always forget if it's 20 or 30 or 40 years ago, but everything that Graham Greene has written has been brilliant. But as a marketer and a search engine guy and someone who's very interested in web marketing, the Yahoo Style Guide is something that I really stand by as a substitute for the AP Style Guide or anything like that if you're doing any type of web writing. But being as how most of our audience is probably not on that end of the spectrum, I'm going to recommend a couple of other things. The first thing is get to know the terminology around disability and developmental disability, intellectual disability. It's really, really important that you substitute the R word with something much more substantive. And it's something that I feel very strongly about. I don't use the R word to refer to anybody because I've heard it leveled at my brother-in-law many, many times. And even though he's largely nonverbal, even though he's a low-functioning autistic, I have seen the way that that word has affected him. So there's a movement called Spread the Word to End the Word. And as egregious and difficult as words like the N-word happen to be, yeah, I hesitate to say nigger on this show, but it's a word that's been reappropriated by others. The word retarded is a word that has not been reappropriated simply because the people who are charged with being retarded have no recourse because they don't have the verbal or cognitive skills to be able to react against that. So I think that I would challenge everyone who's listening today. My endorsement today is to look at the developmental disabilities, the genetic predispositions, all of the things that cause a person to not be quote-unquote normal. Because none of us is normative. But please, 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 don't use the word retarded or retard in a way that disparages people that can't defend themselves. And again, yeah, Zach, I'm sorry. This is the light part of the show. But that's something that I feel very strongly about. And if we're talking about simple, fun endorsements, I'm going to say all of the Curious George books are great. The original Curious George books, I love them. We read them to our 3-month-old son. And the only question that he has every day is, Daddy, why is Curious George called a monkey when he doesn't have a tail? Because clearly monkeys have tails.
Well, your son can't talk yet, so I'm kind of trying to understand how that works. Does he do it telepathically, or?
This is what I feel he's telling me. This is what I feel he's saying to me. And as a matter of fact, when Curious George was first written, there was no difference between monkeys and chimpanzees and things like that. So they were all qualified as monkeys. So we don't have to worry about the man in the yellow hat chopping off Curious George's tail.
Okay.
So that's my lighthearted endorsement.
Well, Brandon, thank you. I will say that appreciate your perspective on the R word and basically giving us, I used to use it, and I used to use it quite frequently, not kind of thinking. So after you actually had a long speech at me a while ago that I took to heart, and now I try to be more sensitive to that. You also made me think.
Well, I'm glad.
That's good. You also made me think of one endorsement that I missed. And guys, I'm sorry. We're like taking forever for two people's endorsements, so I will try to make this as quick as possible. But in Omaha, there is a new organization called Sheltering Tree. You can go there at check out what they're doing, called shelteringtreecommunity.org. But it is an Orthodox sponsored, basically home for the mentally disabled. The two of my good friends are now house parents there. And what they're doing there is incredible. They're basically giving these people who, they have families and they have people who care for them, but their parents might be getting older and not able to care for them as well. So they've decided to basically house them in this basically community place for the mentally disabled, but they're still enough. They're still capable enough to have their own room. And to basically clothe themselves and wash themselves and do all kinds of different things. And it's a wonderful place. So, and they need sponsors for this place. So the reason I bring it up is they just need people to come on board. It's shelteringtreecommunity.org. Okay.
And let's just say, before we move on, just very quickly, these people aren't suffering from deficiency. They're not suffering from really anything. They're not suffering. Their lifestyles are just different from what we consider normative. Okay?
Yeah.
So and I used to rail against this term, but I'm going to bring it up again. They are differently abled, but they are completely capable.
Yeah.
So,
yep, it's true.
I don't know. The next time that you see someone with Down syndrome or autism or anything in your local store, they're just the same as you. They can't communicate the same as you, but they're no different from anyone else.
Yep, that's true.
So treat it that way.
Yeah. Okay, so let's go to Billy. We'll try to make this as quick as possible. we're running
right.
in here.
There's so much I could say, but I think I'll stick to what's really important, which is offering an actual good quality cup of coffee. I am currently brewing the single origin Nuguru from Kenya, roasted by Counterculture at home. And if you want some delicious raisins in your coffee, it's much better than Dunkin' Donuts medium roast. So check it out.
It's on. That's all I got to say. All right. Ron, what do you got to recommend?
Well, in my not-so-serious recommendation, although it's actually fairly important, I'm going to recommend calamine lotion. This last week has been a bad week for mosquitoes in St. Louis, and I made the mistake of taking a walk late at night. And so today, calamine lotion has been my friend.
So is mosquitoes a euphemism for the Ferguson police?
No.
Okay.
I am talking exclusively about actual mosquitoes.
Okay, that was a bad joke. I'm sorry.
No, it was a hilarious joke, but my microphone was muted at the time. I would have laughed at that, and I also would have laughed at the fact that calamine lotion actually does anything, because the science seems to fall on the side of calamine lotion doing nothing.
Can you let
at all.
Ron talk for a second?
He's never let me talk before, so I don't know why he would do it now.
I'm muting my microphone.
My more serious recommendation is Who Count as Persons, Human Identity and the Ethics of Killing, which is a book written by Father John Kavanaugh, who taught medical ethics at St. Louis University and influenced both Aaron and I very deeply. One of the things that I really appreciate about Father Kavanaugh is that although he was a very intelligent philosopher, well-read, able to make good arguments, conversant in the science. He spent some time teaching in Africa. He spent some time working with Mother Teresa in the slums of Calcutta. And he was not just a great teacher, but very truly a father. And I think this comes through in the book, that he's not just trying to make good arguments. He's really deeply trying to engage with the humanity of the people that he writes about, and really trying to get us to engage with their humanity as well. So he was a wonderful teacher to have. It's sad that he is a great loss to the university when he died in November of 2012. But I think the book is a worthy legacy and worth recommending.
Okay, thank you, Ron.
Hey,
go ahead.
I wanted to throw in one very brief, quasi-serious recommendation, and it's related. It's the art of a guy I met when I was getting my Master's of Divinity at North Park in Chicago. He's one of the art teachers there. His name is Tim Lowley, and I've been really struck by his work because his daughter has some significant disabilities, and his sort of expression of that, the love that he has through his art, is really powerful. So I would check out Tim Lowley's work, definitely.
Okay, let's go on and finish off with Aaron's recommendations. Finally, thank you for your patience, sir.
Oh, not a problem. Not a problem. All these are great recommendations. In the coffee line, my favorite roasts are from the Thomas Coffee brand in St. Louis, so you might check those out. But on a serious note, I too was going to recommend some work by Father Kavanaugh, since this is now the Kavanaugh Love Fest. So,
well, I love him, and I haven't even met him yet. So
yes, so I wanted to recommend his book, Following Christ in a Consumer Society, which is aimed at a general audience, and it's a powerful reflection on what it means to follow Christ. So I would recommend Father Kavanaugh's book, Following Christ in a Consumer Society, and then just two other quick, more academic books, and that's one of the books is by Professor Amos Yong, and it's called Down Syndrome and Theology, which is a profound work, and then another book by Hans Reinders called Receiving the Gift of Friendship, Profound Disability, Theological Anthropology and Ethics. I think those are great books to read on these sorts of issues. Then one last little plug for a website called perinatalhospice.org. Our experience in the neonatal intensive care unit and the preparation for Sam's birth, I didn't know it at this time, but it follows a pattern of what's called perinatal hospice care. And there's sort of a movement going to try to get this to become much more prevalent and much more available in communities. And I think it's a worthy cause. So perinatalhospice.org.
Great. And we'll have all of these links to the books and to the websites on our show notes. So lastly, we're going to just plug and say goodnight to the folks here. First, Aaron, where can people find the book? Where would you recommend that they find the book? I should say.
I think the publisher's website, Lipton Stock, or Amazon will be great places to go to look for the book. I also have a Facebook page where I update fairly frequently about the book or about things I'm currently thinking about, and there's links on that. So the Facebook page is just Loving Samuel, and when you look for the book, make sure you use the subtitle, please. So.
Great, thank you, Aaron. Ron, where can people find your stuff?
Spiritualfriendship.org is a website that I founded with Wesley Hill, and cityofgod.net is a personal website.
Great. Billy?
You can find me at Patheos. My blog is called The Orient, or on any number of social media outlets using the name Billy Kangas.
Okay. And finally, Brandon.
Yeah, you can find me on the street corner. I'll be the guy
begging for change,
asking for change and begging to get into the liquor store. No, you can find me at Brandon Peach on Twitter. You can find me on Facebook, Brandon Peach. Look me up. Do not look up Brandon Peaches. There's like some connection with I don't know, 90210, where there was a guy named Brandon who worked at the Peach Pit. Okay. So that's really, really screwed up my rankings on Google. But yeah, if you want to find me, Brandon Peach is my Twitter. And if you do Brandon William Peach online, you'll definitely find me.
Okay, great. I am on partofaplan.com, PARTOFAPLAN. And I am also found at facebook.com/partofaplan. But you can also check out Theologues and check out all of the great writings we've had on there lately. You can find us at TheoloGues.com. Pretty much the same way it's spelled on the podcast. Anyway, we appreciate our guests tonight, Aaron and Ron, for coming by, and we thank you guys for listening to this special podcast, and we hope you check out...
Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah, we hope you check out Loving Samuel, and have a good week. Bye, guys.
Thank you. Bye.